Hello, I'm Aparna Bamzai, and today we're continuing our conversation with Dr. Joe Friday. We're picking up where we left off to hear about how the push from the United States created an intergovernmental process for assessing climate change and climate impacts. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Friday. Do you want to continue and pick up where we left off?
The pressure from the United States and other governments as well caused the formation of a different type of body. The government of the United States and others felt that the scientific community, particularly the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, had no accountability for what they said. They stressed the fact that there should be some sort of an intergovernmental activity. As permanent representative to the World Meteorological Organization, I was directed by our State Department to push for the formation of what would become the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. I worked with quite a few of my colleagues, most notably John Zillman from Australia, John Houghton from the UK, to make sure that we had an IPCC that would do a credible job of the science as well then as satisfying the need for the intergovernmental activity. We created an organization that had 3 working groups, and those working groups were very, very important. The first working group was one on science, an assessment of what the climate science really showed. The second working group was on impacts. What would be the impacts of the climate change that might occur as a result of the increased greenhouse gases? And the third working group was mitigation. What should we be able to do to mitigate the impacts of climate change? But the actual putting that together was extremely complex. We had 170 some odd members of the world community, different countries, trying to work together on that. Each one of them had different interests. From Tuvalu, a small nation out of the Pacific that is maximum elevation of 6 feet above sea level, desperately wanting something to be done to control climate change so they still had a country, to China and the United States, the 2 biggest producers of carbon dioxide in the world, not wanting anyone to impact their ability to continue their industry. So these kind of pressures were such that we had to be very careful on how we assembled that organization. We agreed that initially those 3 major subcommittees would have co-chairs, one from the developing countries and one from the developed country. We also agreed that there would be co-chairs for the IPCC itself, but the biggest thing was the choice of a chairman of the IPCC. It ended up finally being Bert Bolin from Sweden. Bert had been a member of the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, and when his name was first proposed, the United States, not me, because I knew Bert personally, but the United States government was concerned that he would just be another random spokesperson, if you would, for the growing concern on climate change. I knew Bert very well, and I knew that he was a real gentleman and a diplomat, and he had the ability to really work with people and to cause a consensus to develop, even though there may be a lot of different views to start with, but he could do it. And indeed, after the IPCC had been going for a couple of years, I was told by my State Department folks that were very interested in what was going on, that it was one of the best decisions that we made, is having a gentleman like Bert Bolin in charge of that, because he did maintain solid cooperation across all of these different interests. The developing world was very concerned about this. I still remember Dr. Roman Quintanar, the head of the Philippine Weather Service, telling me one time in a discussion that they were getting very sick and tired of being nothing but a carbon sink for the industrialized world. So these were the kind of emotions that were running in this process. Obviously, the fossil fuel industry didn't want anything to happen that would interfere with the production of their fuels. But the developing world needed to have some assurance that they would be able to develop their capabilities as well. So again, tremendous pressures, tremendous balancing act. The selection of some very good people to head those subcommittees initially made the IPC a success. Dr. John Houghton from the UK, served as the chair of Working Group 1, and in 1990 produced the first assessment report of the IPCC, which, although fairly modest in comparison to the way the last assessment report a couple of years ago stated things, did point out the fact that the globe was indeed warming and that human activity was at least responsible for part of it. And that was a major finding. That helped move forward the process one more time. The IPCC was formed. I attended the first couple of meetings as a part of the U.S. delegation, and after that, particularly the IPCC section itself became very, very politically oriented, and I decided I didn't need to do anything on that. I had a National Weather Service to run. I would get back to that. But it was a fun time. It was fun seeing that work. And it's also nice to be a part of something that is still in existence today and still providing meaningful information for the whole world.
Wow, so once all of this momentum for climate change research had been started on the international stage, how did the policy world respond?
Well, the policy world was now faced with a dilemma in some respects. They had the first assessment report. The World Meteorological Organization held the second World Climate Conference in 1990, right after the assessment report came out, and so they dealt with the response to that. And I attended that second World Climate Conference, and it was amazing because there were signs posted around the conference center declaring Margaret Thatcher and George Bush the worst kind of people because we were contaminating the world and various things of that nature. There were lobbying groups from the fossil fuel industry pointing out the fact that they were good guys. All of this pressure going on in the midst of a scientific conference. It called for the formation of a body to start to address the whole issue of climate change in a more formal way. As a result of this, the Rio Conference occurring in 1992 created the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, it wasn't a climate change convention per se, but it was a framework for climate change. They couldn't come to agreement with what we should be doing, but they did come to an agreement with the fact that we should continue to meet and establish a framework to how to address these various items. And I think you've already covered in some of your material the history of that, going in with the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first attempt to try to get the global population of the world to start to address these individual actions. And then the final Paris Agreement that occurred last year, which was trying to get a more formal commitment for the amount of reductions in greenhouse gases and the like. I noted with some alarm that only 23 countries have so far ratified the Paris Agreement, and it only represents 1.08% of the carbon emission. So the Paris Agreement will not come into formal force, the Paris Treaty will not come into formal force until 55 countries have ratified it, representing 55% of the emissions. So all of this scientific work that was done in the 1950s and 1960s, the assessments that were done by the National Academy of Science in 1979, the First World Climate Conference, the Second World Climate Conference, the IPCC, all of their assessment reports, have continued to move the ball forward. There are a lot of people that think it's moving much too slowly, and I tend to be one of those. But nonetheless, we still are making progress. And it's nice to see the fact that the globe, the world, is finally beginning to recognize that we need to do something. It's even nice to see some of the industries actually come through and start to say, what do we need to do to address the future? Because it's going to impact all of us in the long run. It's going to impact every human being on the earth, whether it's in manufactured goods and the cost of those goods, whether it's in whether you can live on the sea level or in the ocean coast or not. It's going to impact all of us by the time this is all over. So we really do need to have a global response.
Dr. Friday, thank you so much for giving us your personal account of this critical period in our history of climate change research and policy. It's been invaluable to hear from you.
Delighted to be able to share some thoughts. Really appreciate the opportunity.